If you want to be a better writer, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Knives Out so that we can study genre. This 2019 murder mystery film was written and directed by Rian Johnson. Rotten Tomatoes scores this movie at 97% on the tomato meter, and it gets a massive 92% audience score as well. So Valerie, is this part of why you pitched this movie for us to analyse?
Okay, well, to be honest, I pitched Knives Out because it's a romp. I just had so much fun watching it the first time. And because this is one of my all-time favorite genres. I could talk about it for hours, but I will do my best to stay focused. Because you know me, all I need is an open mic and off I go. And Melanie, I know you love this genre as well, and I know you have a lot to say about it. So I will try and be as concise as I can so I don't eat up your time. Now, as always, for those of you listening, I'm going to give you a blanket spoiler alert because we can't talk about a movie without talking about a movie. Alrighty, so as you know, this season we are discussing genre, and broadly speaking, this is a crime story. But there are lots of different types of crime stories. And to sort of add to the complexity of all this, most of the subgenres within crime are described in a whole bunch of different ways. So Knives Out can fit into any of the following genre descriptions. It can be called a murder mystery, a master detective crime story, or a cozy mystery. It's a story that evokes the spirit of Agatha Christie mysteries. It's a whodunnit from the golden age of murder mysteries. It's like a game of Clue, but in movie form. And I also love Clue, I have to admit. The emphasis is not on the crime, it's on who committed the crime. And because of that, these stories have very little description of the murder. They don't contain grisly descriptions of the dead body, nor do they include the types of forensic pathology that's found in stories by, say, Kathy Reichs. I know I had a hard time reading her books. It was a bit too much for me. In Knives Out, we know that Harlan killed himself. We see it early on. So that isn't actually the crime we're trying to solve. What we're thinking about, and the central dramatic question of this particular story, first, we're wondering if Marta will be found out, for having mixed up the medication. Then we're wondering who is trying to frame Marta. Somebody wanted Harlan dead, and they used Marta as a proxy of sorts. So who was it? These types of mysteries are also kind of light on the details of police procedure or investigative procedure. Yes, there are often professional police officers in the stories, and here we do have a couple of local detectives in Knives Out, but typically they're either not clever enough to solve the crime themselves, or they need some kind of help from the detective to solve the crime and to help them investigate. Now, the person helping them investigate could be a professional detective like Benoit Blanc, or it could be an amateur sleuth like Jessica Fletcher or Miss Marple. In Knives Out, the police have actually solved the crime accurately. They rule it as a suicide, and it actually is a suicide. See, I told you there was going to be spoilers. But the police are keeping the case open to help Blanc, who's clearly a friend of theirs because they refer to him as Benny, because Blanc has been hired by an unknown party. And I thought that was actually kind of a nice little twist. These types of stories are intellectual puzzles. They're literary games that are played between an author and her reader. And I can't get enough of them. I just love them. As audience members, when we enter into these stories, we're trying to solve the mystery before the author reveals it to us. So, while on one level, we hope we'll solve the puzzle, on another level, we're really hoping the author will get the better of us because that big reveal at the end of the story is just so much fun. And that big reveal in this type of a crime story is called a denouement. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But if we do guess who done it, who the murderer is, hopefully we won't guess how the murder was committed or why it was committed. So I tend to call this type of a crime story a whodunit. And just like every other genre, it is constantly evolving. Now, over on my inner circle, I did a series of unpodcast episodes. Those are monthly recordings I send out to the people who are part of the inner circle. And I did a whole study about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which, believe it or not, is a crime story. Now, it's obviously very early. It's an early form of the genre because The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was published in 1886. So it doesn't include all of the conventions that we're used to seeing now in 2022, obviously. For example, there's no master detective because at that time, the job of detective, it wasn't even a thing. It wasn't a job that existed yet. So what I did in the inner circle was track the history of crime stories from Stevenson's novel right up to Agatha Christie's work. So if you're writing any type of crime story, those are episodes I recommend you go listen to. You can access them by going to valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and subscribe from there. For now, though, just let me say that the crime story as we know it really all started with Agatha Christie. She is the undisputed queen of mystery. In fact, we can say she's the queen of modern novels, modern mystery novels, because with more than 2 billion books sold, she's the highest selling author of all time. Not bad, right? So, this is a really popular type of story. And writers who know how to do it and who can pull it off and do it well, they can write their own ticket. So the question then becomes, what does it take to pull off a whodunit?
So that's a really important point that you've raised, Valerie, because in doing the study for this week's episode and in the previous study that I've done also on these types of story, it's really become clear that murder mysteries are one of the most conventioned genres there are. And master detective stories, I think, as a subset of the murder mystery subgenre, which sits under the crime genre, these stories are the third most popular genre in commercial terms, and they come in behind romance and self-help books. So they are very popular, and a lot of people read them. So there must be some very clear expectations and conventions that can't be messed with. And I think this was really well understood by the people who wrote them, especially around in Agatha Christie's time. And again, in doing the research, I came across a gentleman called Roland Knox, who was born in 1888 and died in 1957. Now, he was an English priest, a theologian, and author of detective stories. And he wrote a paper called The 10 Commandments of Detective Fiction in 1929. So Knox was also a member of the Detection Club, which was a group formally organised in 1930. And membership was and still is by invitation only. And the original membership included Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, and G.K. Chesterton. So how would you make sure that you understand what the conventions are, considering how many there are and how well they're understood?
I really want to be a member of the Detection Club. I'm just putting that out there. I think I actually have to write crime stories to even get a look in, but I'm fascinated by the Detection Club. Alrighty, so you asked me about conventions. Let's stay focused here, Valerie. Well, it's the first thing, and I say this to all my clients, I say this to every writer that I meet. If you're going to write in a particular genre, you have to read that genre. And never is that more true than in this particular genre of whodunits and crime stories. You must read the people who are writing them now, but who wrote them before. Like, start from Agatha Christie and work your way up through the decades. This is non-negotiable. Yes, it takes time, but if you don't know what's come before, you are shooting yourself in the foot. Because what you're doing when you're writing a whodunit is you're creating a puzzle for someone to solve. The whodunits are all about the puzzle. That means that you can't reuse a puzzle or a strategy or a clue or a trope that has come before, because once someone has solved a particular puzzle, they can solve it again. They recognize it. They know how it works. And they're going to solve it. Your reader is going to solve your puzzle before you reveal who done it, why they did it, and how they did it. And if they do that, I'm afraid to tell you, I mean, they're just going to toss your book aside, and they're not going to give a second book by you a chance, especially if they solve the book very early on. Let me give you an example. One of the tropes that is often used is having a character who seems too good to be true, and in fact, they are too good to be true. It could be an overly devoted husband who is unnaturally good-natured, because everybody loses their temper sooner or later. It could be a nerdy wallflower who idolizes the popular guy or the popular girl. It could be a sycophant. You get the idea. And those are examples from 3 mysteries one of them was a TV show. The others are 2 novels that I solved very, very quickly because I had seen it before. It's not that I'm that clever. I just read a lot of books, so I solved it really quickly, and it was so disappointing. So you get the idea of what I'm talking about right here, right? So readers of this genre know that when they see this type of character who seems too good to be true, it's like that character has a flashing neon sign over their head, and the word killer, killer, killer is flashing over their head, or there's like this big arrow pointing at that character. Now, if you are familiar with this, you can do 2 things. You can avoid having that type of character by making sure all of your characters have some sort of a dimension to them, or you can plant that type of character intentionally as a red herring to misdirect your reader. But either way, you got to know what's going on. So if you're not an avid reader of mystery stories, then simply put, your reader is going to outsmart you. And if that happens, it's game over. Now, there is a technique where you, the author, can reveal the killer very early in the story, and then you put the protagonist in danger of becoming the killer's next victim. Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of books where that happens, lots of stories where that happens. It's a very different type of story, though. That kind of a story crosses over into thriller territory or possibly even a horror story, depending on how you want to approach it. So these types of stories are plot driven. A whodunit is a plot driven novel where the plot is built upon clues, red herrings, and cuttlefish. Now, what the heck's a cuttlefish when it comes to storytelling? These are clues that are hidden in plain sight, camouflaged, right? That's why I call it a cuttlefish, because the clues are camouflaged. They're there. The author lets you know that they're there, but you just don't see them. Agatha Christie was really good at this. Now, it's important to note here that cuttlefish are presented very differently in a film than they are in a novel. In a film, the writer or director can show you the same image over and over. And in Knives Out, we have exactly that. We have got this big circular knife sculpture. And we also have Nana saying the name Ransom over and over. In the film, that circular sculpture just looks like a really cool visual element on the screen. And we can this is going to sound awful, we can kind of disregard Nana as just being an old senile woman who maybe thinks everybody is Ransom or, what have you. We can easily ignore it in a film. But in prose, the author has to deliberately draw the reader's attention. So if As the author, I'm constantly describing that same circular sculpture. Then I'm drawing the reader's attention to it over and over and over, which signals to the reader that that sculpture is important. I think you get the point. So while the plot has to be innovative and intricate, the characters, oddly enough, tend to be stereotypes. I find this really interesting. But even that is evolving because, as I said off the top, this is a genre that's evolving. In Knives Out, we have our stock characters in Harlan, his family, the house staff, the police, and even Benoit Blanc. But Marta is a bit different. She's not a stereotype. Now, I wouldn't say she's a particularly complex character, and she doesn't have like a lot of layers to her, but she certainly has more layers than the other characters and more layers than the type of character we're used to seeing in this type of a story. For starters, she has a backstory. Even Poirot, who was the hero of 33 Christie novels, he doesn't even have a backstory. Well, there's a few little bits of information passed along, but there's not really a backstory. Honestly, I think modern readers will still happily embrace stereotypical characters in a whodunit, provided that they are well written and providing that the puzzle is extremely difficult or preferably impossible for them to solve. The geriatric amateur sleuth has been around since Miss Marple was introduced in 1927, nearly 100 years ago. And we're still using it because Only Murders in the Building, which is just in the last year or so, is a huge hit. Yeah, listen, the older I get, the more I dislike that word geriatric. But anyway, moving on. The whodunit often has comic elements in it. Now, they're not necessarily comedies, although Only Murders in the Building is pretty funny. But they tend to be lighthearted. As I said, there isn't a focus on the blood and guts and the gore of the victim having died. In fact, there might not be any blood at all, even if the person was stabbed. And it's kind of a running joke if you look at Columbo or Murder, She Wrote or the early Agatha Christie. You got a body with a knife in it, but there's absolutely no blood. It's great. They're lighthearted and they can sometimes have a character who is comedic or possibly even clownish or at the very least witty. And the humor could even be dry. These type of stories have a closed community. They typically take place in an English countryside, that's Agatha Christie, or an American small town, which is usually New England. In Jessica Fletcher, Murder, She Wrote, we've got Cabot Cove. And here in Knives Out, the Thrombey house is in Massachusetts. And this is something I like about Only Murders in the Building. They innovated this by extending the idea of what a small community or closed community is, because that takes place in a condo building amongst the condo owners, one building in New York City. So, yeah, it's New York City, which it sounds like it's not part of the convention, but they created the community within the city by focusing everything on what's happening in that building and the people who live in that building. Now, even though there's a closed community, there's a large cast. That's another convention. And this is Agatha Christie 101. And there's a certain irony to this because typically when we're writing a novel, what we want to do is make our cast as small and as tight as possible. Here in a whodunit, we're going opposite to that. The reason is because you want to have a lot of credible suspects. It could be any one of a number of people. The girl on the train actually fell victim to this. There weren't a lot of suspects, so it was pretty easy to work out who the killer was. But think about what I said a minute ago. The Girl on the Train is actually a thriller. So what Paula Hawkins did was to use that information to put Rachel Watson in jeopardy. So Paula Hawkins then switched the form of narrative drive from mystery at the beginning of the story to dramatic irony, ultimately to suspense. So the idea of the large cast is an Agatha Christie convention, and when the film versions are made, right back from the beginning, right up to today, they are featuring star-studded ensemble casts, right? Kenneth Branagh has continued in this tradition when he remade Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile. And here, Ryan Johnson is doing the same with Knives Out. I mean, the entire cast is pretty cool. There's also a denouement, which I mentioned off the top. This is, again, one of the Agatha Christie inventions, and it's an absolute must-have for a whodunit. It started with Christie's first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, when she had Poirot assemble all the suspects in the drawing room and confront them one by one until he finally pronounces who the killer is. And Benoit Blanc does the same thing. Now, he doesn't assemble everyone in that office or in that room where the circular sculpture is, but he does kind of the same thing where he talks through the clues and whatnot with the key characters. Now, this whole idea of a denouement is something you want to pay attention to. Why? Because the denouement is pure exposition. It is not a working scene. And that is just fine by the reader, because by the time you get to this part in the story, it's usually the last scene of a book or very close to the end of the book or very close to the end of the movie. By then, the reader just wants to know how close they came to solving the puzzle. Did they figure out who done it, how it was done, and why? Now, the biggest challenge with this type of story is building the puzzle. As writers, we've got to dream up the perfect airtight crime that is very difficult to solve. Yet, when the killer is revealed, the answer has to be plausible. The ending of a murder mystery must be, as David Mamet says, both surprising and inevitable. To pull this off, you must, I said this at the beginning, you must read and study the masters of the genre. You have to. There is no way around it. There's no cutting corners. A reader will happily go along with characters who they've seen 1,000 times before, but there is zero tolerance for a story with a plot that they've seen even one time before. Now, unfortunately, Knives Out didn't build the perfect crime. There are at least 2 errors. Spoilers, here are more spoilers coming. Yes, Ransom could still have set Marta up, but it would have had to have been premeditated. He also could have still killed Fran, but not in the way Ryan Johnson says. I'll leave it at that because I don't want to totally ruin this film for you, because it is fun. It's a hoot and a half. So remember, this type of whodunit is about engaging the reader's head primarily, not their heart. And again, this is another area where the whodunit is kind of opposite to what we're typically trying to accomplish when we're writing a novel. Because what we want to do typically is develop empathy for the protagonist and create an emotional connection with the story, with the characters. We want our readers to feel something. Now, yes, we still want there to be an emotional connection to the story. We want Benoit to solve the crime. We want Marta to get off. We want Poirot to solve the crime, or Miss Marple, or Jessica Fletcher, or Columbo, because we like them. We want them to solve the crime. But primarily, what we're trying to do is engage the reader's mind, the intellect of the reader, more than their heart. So it's sort of a mind over heart type of story. Melanie?
So they were all really good points. And I think, like we said before, there are lots of conventions. And I agree with you. This is really an intellectual activity as an author and as a reader. And maybe that's what, if you're into puzzles and solving puzzles, even Wordle or doing crosswords, then you're probably going to read a lot more of these types of murder mystery stories. So, and I agree with you. I think this is a fun movie. It's a bit of a romp. And it was really great to see Daniel Craig play Benoit Blanc. And I'm going to apologize for my Australian accent murdering any French any French pronunciations. But it was really good to see him play a very different character. And I really love that line that Ransom says when he's talking to Benoit about, you with the Kentucky Fried Foghorn Raghorn drawl, because I think, again, that was really Daniel Craig breaking away from his Bond character. And I think Knives Out is an interesting movie because it bends quite a few of the standard conventions of the master detective crime genre. And I'm going to walk through some of the why and how I've come to that conclusion. So I've been deep diving into murder mysteries for a few years now, and I think it started when I completed a deep dive into A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle for my StoryGrid editor certification. And as a planner and a plotter, I am really fascinated by the plotting that's required for master detective stories. So I haven't really referred much to the theory books like we have done in previous episodes for today's podcast, because I think the detective novels conventions and expectations are quite well known, even if you're not conscious of it, and especially if you are a reader of those types of stories. And here's a very serendipitous type of story that supports my statement above. So last night, I finished the book Geiger, which is a spy crime mystery novel written by Gustav Skodemann. And I immediately started with a novel called Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. And I think just the title alone on that book is really a hook in itself. And the prologue in this book is titled Ronald Knox's 10 Commandments of Detective Fiction. So as soon as I put dinner in the oven, I quickly went and did some research, and I mentioned Knox before in the episode. And I have to thank Sean O'Neill Writer and Elizabeth Spann Craig's web pages for what I discovered about Knox's 10 Commandments. And so while some of the 10 Commandments are dated, they really demonstrate how the conventions in this genre have been documented for nearly a century. So I'll just quickly read through them. So the first one is, the criminal must be someone mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. Number 2, all supernatural or preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course. Not more than one secret room or passage is allowable. So think about that in the context of Knives Out. Number 4, no hitherto undiscovered poisons may be used, nor any appliance which will need a long scientific explanation at the end. Number 5, no evil mastermind character must figure in your story. Number 6, no accident must ever help the detective, nor must he ever have an unaccountable intuition which proves to be right. Number 7, the detective must not himself commit the crime. Number 8, the detective must not light on any clues which are not instantly produced for the inspection of the reader. Number 9, the stupid friend of the detective, the Watson, must not conceal any thoughts which pass through his mind. His intelligence must be slightly, but very slightly below that of the average reader. And number 10, twin brothers or sisters or doubles generally must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. So that's really interesting, right? That list of conventions or commandments, as Knox puts it. But I would easily summarize those commandments or Knox's commandments as treat the reader with respect, especially because the readers of these types of stories want to follow on and they want a chance to work out who did it. So you need to have all of those things in mind. So how do you respect the readers of detective stories? Well, these stories need careful plotting and consideration about where the information will be revealed and how much will be revealed. Red herrings are essential, and we must go with the master detective or the protagonist down some of those rabbit holes. But Valerie has already covered off on red herrings and cuttlefish, so I won't go into that any further. And because I'm a reader and I'm really studying this genre now, like I did for the spy stories, I've sketched out some conventions of my own for master detective stories. And again, these are working ideas. And I realized when I was looking at Knox's rules that there are some similarities with what I've got and what he has listed as his commandments, which I think confirms that this genre is very attuned to its conventions. So I've tested some of my conventions on a few series that I've been reading over the past 2 years, including the Hamish Macbeth series by MC Beaton, the Hawthorne series by Anthony Horowitz, Sherlock Holmes and Poirot. Plus, I watch a lot of British crime stories like Vera and Midsummer Murders and Inspector Linley. And I even watch the Murdoch Mysteries, which are a Canadian series. So I think the following 8 conventions hold some water, even if they're not complete.
Woohoo! Murdoch Mysteries.
I love Murdoch. I think he's great. So, here's my 8. Here's some of 8 that I've got, and I think there'll be more added to, especially after having done this, the analysis on Knives Out. So, number 1, a sidekick is essential to translate the master detective's actions to the ordinary person. 2, the master detective explains how they pieced the clues together to demonstrate how skilled they are compared to the average person, because they are the only ones who can solve the whodunnit. So that's the denouement. Number 3, conventional crime solvers like the police disregard or doubt the master detective and write their theories off. Number 4, the crime and detection take place within a closed community. Number 5, the victim has a secret, and so do the suspects. Number 6, master detective has their own quirks and oddities. And number 7, master detective is seldom wrong and knows who committed the crime well and how they did it well before everybody else. And then number 8, which is pretty much a work in progress still, there are multiple suspects or no obvious ones. So when I reviewed Knives Out via these conventions, there were some interesting things that are revealed. So I won't say what they are, but follow along with me. So the first one, the sidekick is essential to translate master detective actions to the ordinary person. So Benoit Blanc assigns Marta to be his Watson for the investigation into the proposed murder of Harlan Thrombey. However, Marta doesn't interpret or report on Blanc's progress like a Watson would. Instead, she is actively trying to hamper his investigation so she doesn't get accused of Harlan's murder. So that's an interesting twist. Number 2, the master detective explains how they've pieced together the clues. So this is the denouement. And Blanc starts the denouement, but he has a few holes in his holy donut theory. However, as he talks through it, Marta actually fills in the blanks for him. He is well and truly on the right track and has worked out the parts of the solution that don't appear on the screen, whereas Marta's pieces of the puzzle have been on the screen. So that's a really interesting way that the story or the denouement came together. Number 3, conventional crime solvers like the police disregard or doubt the master detective. So the police, Detective Elliot, doesn't buy Blanc's theory that Harlan was murdered because of the evidence at the scene. However, Trooper Wagner, who's along for the ride, and he understands that there's something interesting going on and unfolding in front of him. So the interesting thing here is that Detective Elliot was right. Harlan did commit suicide. He just doesn't know the circumstances and the other things going on around Harlan at the time. So the next one, the crime and detection take place within a closed community. And as Valerie has mentioned, most of the going on happen at the Thrombeys' house. And everyone who is a suspect was at Harlan's 85th birthday party. There is a convention called the Locked Room, which is a known Agatha Christie convention. And I think this movie very much sticks to that style of storytelling and that Locked Room convention. So the victims and the suspects have a secret. So I'm going to call Marta the victim here because most of the story is focused on her. She does have a secret about why and how Harlan died, and it's that secret that she's trying to keep hidden so that her mother doesn't get deported. So Harlan does have a few secrets at the start of the film, but they get revealed very early and become the motives for the family members who are under suspicion. The master detective has their own quirks and oddities. So Blanc has some very interesting things that he does in the movie, like hitting the piano key to draw attention to himself during the family member interviews, flicking the coin, and the way he speaks. And he says some really odd things like physical evidence can tell a clear story with a forked tongue. And my personal favorite is we see that the donut hole has a hole in its center. It is not a donut hole at all, but a small donut with its own hole. And our donut is not a whole donut at all. The next one, the master detective is seldom wrong and knows well before everybody else. And Blanc, at the very beginning of the movie, states the question that is the key to solving the whodunit mystery. And it is, why was Blanc hired and by whom? And this is what seems to drive him forward. And it's the very problem that leads him to identifying Harlan's would-be killer. He also seems to connect the less obvious parts of the mystery together, trying to work out who is it that hired him. There are multiple suspects or no obvious ones. So as I mentioned, I'm sort of thinking about this and I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail a bit later on. And Knives Out doesn't strictly follow the conventions of a master detective story. There are some things that happen in the movie as well that bend some of the rules of this genre. So master detective stories are usually told from the point of view fixed on the detective or are told by the sidekick but focused on the detective. So the point of view character or protagonist in Knives Out is not Blanc, the master detective, it's Marta. There's a subversion of the suicide, then discovery that it was murder setup that can happen in these types of stories. Knives Out has a suicide, murder, but it's really a suicide. And the denouement is not in front of the cast. It has a limited audience, but it has all the other characteristics of the explanation. And Blanc hasn't pieced everything together, so Marta helps him, which I've talked about before. So the audience is also diverted away from thinking about who did it by focusing on Marta and our concern about her not getting caught. We also know what happened and why Harlan died very early in the movie, so our sympathy lies with Marta and not the master detective. So what does all of this mean? Well, you need to think about the information in a story and how you present it and when. The murder mystery is about information and focus. It's about plotting, being deliberate, and sometimes being deliberately obscure.
Melanie, can I just jump in here for a minute? I wanted to follow up on that phrase, deliberately obscure, because I'm not sure if I'm understanding what you mean there. Because to me, when the author is writing the mystery, yes, there are red herrings, yes, there are cuttlefish, but we meaning, the writers, are not being deliberately obscure. To me, the beauty in a really well-crafted whodunit is that all of the clues everything you need to know is right there on the page. You just have to know how to string them together. You have to know what to pay attention to, what clues to rule out, what ones to rule in, which characters you can rule out right away, which ones might be in the short list of possible suspects. But we're not trying to obscure any facts. We're actually putting it all there on the page. So what what do you mean by deliberately obscure?
So I suppose what I mean there is that things that are presented, that are in the story, like it's more like the cuttlefish, they're in the story, but they're not actually clues or considered clues until right at the end when the denouement happens, is really what I mean by being deliberately obscure. Because as you're writing those stories, you have to include those clues in there. And usually they're just things, particularly with cuttlefish, that are just glossed over, that they don't have any significance. They're there on the page, and when all the pieces come together, you understand the significance. But in the story, you as the writer are being deliberately obscure about not really drawing attention to something. That's what I mean by that. And maybe that's a very clunky phrase that I've used there. So that might need a bit of work. I might need to be more precise in my language about when I think about this and start putting a few more things together for the blog post that I'm going to do about this story. So that's what I mean by deliberately obscure. And I think that really causes us to think about how would you plot as a writer? How do you plot these stories? And so I think there should be two plots going on in your head, the one that you write about and the one that the master detective is working in the background. So kind of like an iceberg, I suppose. There's what you see as the reader on the surface, and then there's the work that the master detective is doing to work out the shape and size of the iceberg under the water. And I think that is how I would approach these stories, is to have those two lines of plotting going on and looking at where do I need to plant my key clues, the obvious ones and the ones that mislead you, so the red herrings, and then the ones that are what I've called obscure, but they're there, but they're not actually something you automatically link to the investigation. So I just want to go back for a minute to the suspects. And when writing a murder mystery, we really must understand, I think, who the suspects are. And we have to believe that they are plausible suspects and that they have motive, intent, and opportunity as the story unfolds. And of course, over the story, and over the course of the investigation, some of the suspects will be cleared and then some new ones will be added into the list. And while this might really sound obvious, I think it's good to think about where your murderer exists in the story in relation to the master detective as well. And I believe there are 3 to 4 main suspect pools in a murder mystery. And I've also added one of Knox's rules in my little bucket of considerations about suspects. So I think the suspects could be closest to the detectives and almost appear to be a victim. And then your job is to deflect, or to make sure, as Valerie mentioned, that they're too good to be true or they're above suspicion, and their motive is the least likely or the most obscure motive that's not on the page or that comes through at the very last minute. You also have someone from the pool of obvious suspects, so it's anyone's guess. And the murderer is a contender, but gets overlooked for others with more obvious motives or probable causes. And then there's the least likely, which is so removed from the obvious suspects. And it's not until a key piece of information that the master detective gets right at the end that leads them to piece everything together. And their motives might come from something that happened in the distant past. And a good example of that is the Agatha Christie novel, The Mirror Cracked, and also A Study in Scarlet, which is a Sherlock Holmes novel. And then finally, this rule that came in from Knox. So the master detective is not the murderer. And this leads me nicely into the exceptions. And I think there are exceptions to what I've just mentioned about the suspects. So the first one is the whole cast did it, which was, of course, made famous by Murder on the Orient Express. The murderer is one of the victims, which comes from the novel And Then There Were None. And then finally, the master detective did it, where, again, Agatha Christie breaks this rule in her story Curtain, where Poirot breaks this ultimate commandment. But it's good to think about the suspects and where they're going to sit, I think, as you're plotting and planning your novel. And there are some other great takeaways, I think, that come from Knives Out that are worth mentioning. There are some fabulous setups and payoffs, which I think is really good and also adds to the feeling of being rewarded after you've watched this movie. So the knife. So Harlan makes a comment about not being able to tell the difference between a real knife and a movie prop. There is a spot of blood on Marta's shoe that we see at the beginning that does get paid off at the end. The invisible ink on Harla's letter to Linda, Ransom's name, which I think is very interesting, the clue about the dogs barking in the night, Marta vomiting if she tells a lie. That actually is such a clever thing to do to your main protagonist and really sets up the ending quite well. I think there's beauty in the family telling Ransom that being cut out of the will be good for him. And then there's the cup with the writing on it, Harlan's cup, which it says, "My house, my rules, my coffee." And then at the end of the movie, Marta's standing on the balcony looking down at the family below, holding that cup. There's Fran's stash, which is where she hides the tox report, and the name of Hugh Ransom Drysdale, where Hugh says to the detectives, "Call me Ransom, the help call me Hugh." And this is really well paid off with Fran when she says, "It was Hugh, it was Hugh." So again, spoilers, sorry. Knives Out is probably not the best master detective story, but it was a really interesting story to analyse and to see also from the point of view of bending the rules and if it works or not. And there are some great lessons to be learnt, I think, from it, from sticking to the conventions of this particular subgenre.
Oh my God, I love this genre. Okay, we've done very well sticking to task. Before we go, I have a couple of books that I would like to recommend for anyone who is writing a whodunit. These are resources that I suggest that you read to help deepen your understanding of how these types of stories work. The first one is called How Done It. It's edited by Martin Edwards, who is the president of the Detection Club that I mentioned earlier. The second one is called The Golden Age of Murder, and it's actually by Martin Edwards. The third one is called Murder for Pleasure, The Life and Times of the Detective Story by Howard Haycraft. And then just for fun, because this is a fascinating read, there is Agatha Christie's Complete Secret Notebooks, Stories and Secrets of Murder in the Making. It's by John Curran. It is just what it sounds like. It's her notebooks with her ideas, and you can see stories evolving. Oh, it's really interesting. Okay, we wind up each episode with a little action step, a little bit of homework for you guys. This week, what I want you to do is look at the ending of your novel or your screenplay. Off the top of the show, I said that for whodunits, the ending must be surprising yet inevitable. Well, this is actually true for all stories, regardless of genre. So take a look at your story and ask yourself whether you've created an ending that is both surprising and inevitable.
So that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Star Wars Rogue One. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook as Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.